Let's get started, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited for the second week of the Big Ideas and Inequality series. So we actually have 6 big ideas this week, so we'll keep it a little bit shorter. And I'm incredibly excited to hear from all of our panelists. I'm just going to jump right in. They're going to briefly introduce themselves and then talk for about 8 to 10 minutes. And then we'll have a period at the end for question and answers where I'll be calling on people and trying to direct the conversation. So if you can hold off on questions until that period, just so our speakers can get through everything. So we're going to start with Heather Boucher. Heather, take it away whenever you're ready.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much. Well, this is great to be here today. So I'm Heather Boucher. I am the president, CEO, and co-founder of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. I'm also the author of Bound, How Inequality Constricts Our Economy and What We Can Do About It. So we launched Equitable Growth in November of 2013 with the goal of advancing evidence-backed ideas and policies in pursuit of growth that is strong, stable, and broadly shared. And we fund scholars to investigate questions of whether and how economic inequality in all of its forms affects economic growth and stability. And these are critical questions because the landscape in which we enact in our economy has actually shifted quite dramatically. Over the past few decades, as many of us know, economists have documented this rise in inequality across income and wealth, alongside a fall in upward mobility. So research by Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, and Gabriel Zucman finds that since 1980, workers at the 40th percentile of the income distribution have seen their incomes grow by just 0.3% a year, from about $26,400 to $29,800 in 2016 dollars. This group includes many of the workers that we've seen are so essential in 2020, home care workers, bank tellers, and preschool and kindergarten teachers. And of course, at the other end of the income ladder, the richest have seen their incomes skyrocket. Someone in the top 0.1% would have seen their post-tax income almost quadruple, increase 4 times since 1980. And of course, we know the distribution of wealth across US families has become even more unequal as fortunes calcify among the already rich. And there's a lot of evidence that this kind of inequality is hindering upward mobility, obstructing people from moving up as the rungs on the ladder get further and further apart. Raj Chetty, of course, has shown that children in the United States used to have a 90% chance of out-earning their parents. And today, that chance has fallen to about half. So whereas in 1963, John F. Kennedy could say, "A rising tide lifts all boats," Gene Sperling, who advised both President Clinton and President Obama, would say, quote, "The rising tide will lift some boats, but others will run aground." So over the past 7 years, Equitable Growth has funded over 250 scholars with over $6.5 million in funding in order to understand how high income and wealth inequality, as well as the rising concentration across firms, affects not just who ends up with the money, that is distribution, but what is produced and how. And so my big idea that I want to talk to you about today is this. As we've culled through the research and evidence, we can see a new understanding of what makes the economy grow, one that centers the role of economic inequality. Now, of course, this new research was made possible by increased computing capacity, access to new data, and sophisticated empirical techniques that economists have spent decades developing. And as we look through all the new evidence, we can see how scholars have found what philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn calls anomalies. That is, empirical findings that sit outside the normal bounds of what is considered a research field. And as new research emerges, it seems that economics is in the middle of what Kuhn would call a paradigm shift. We find that inequality matters to how markets themselves function. And as I lay out in my book Unbound, it constricts the pathways to strong, stable, and broadly shared growth. So the story used to go something like this. If the rich get richer, they will use that money to invest, and this will create more jobs and more opportunity and more growth. So in the next iteration of the economy, it isn't necessarily the case that those incomes would calcify into higher wealth. As long as markets were left to their own devices, then we would see broadly shared improvements in well-being. And of course, part of the reason that we're having this seminar today and that we're talking about inequality is because we know that that has not been the case. What we find instead is that inequality has systemically constricted our economy in three specific ways. It obstructs the supply of people and ideas into the economy, limiting opportunities for those not already at the top, which slows productivity growth over time. Second, it subverts the institutions that manage the market, making our political system ineffective and our markets themselves dysfunctional. And finally, these combined distort our macroeconomy through their effects on both consumption and investment, which both drags down and destabilizes both short and long-term growth in economic output. As we see inequality affecting economic outcomes, we're learning that we need to know more about how economic power translates into social and political power. As we study inequality, we're learning that we cannot rely on markets to do the work of governing. If we want to see growth that is strong, stable, and broadly shared, we need to contain high-end inequality and provide counterweights to concentrated economic power. This will require bold action. We need to rethink how we tax capital, how we tax at the top. We need to rethink our antitrust laws and how we enforce them. And we need to think about how we empower workers across the wage distribution through unions or through other mechanisms. And of course, we also need to make sure that we're making those investments in the next generation so they have that opportunity. We know that there's so much evidence that early childhood is an area of life where the United States is not making sufficient investments. Yet these conclusions and this direction is too often obscured when we talk about the economy in public debates. So just to take one piece of evidence, when we talk about how well the economy is performing, we tend to focus on aggregate national income or gross domestic product. But in order to understand how well the economy is performing, we cannot simply look to aggregates. This is because in our economy today, most of the growth is going to those at the top. So just as economists played a pivotal role nearly a century ago, crafting tools that allowed policymakers to measure economic progress, we need economists to come together today to craft new tools that match the current economic moment. If we are to strengthen public investment, challenge austerity, and create growth for all, we have to have new metrics for our new economy. And so we have been working with academics and with policymakers to encourage the Bureau of Economic Analysis to incorporate the distribution into our nation's national accounts. This would ensure that policymakers and the public know not just how much the economy grew in the aggregate, but who that growth went to, who across the income distribution, and ideally across place and across race and gender, who saw the gains of growth. Adding distribution to our national conversation about our core economic metric could facilitate the diagnosis of the diagnosis of what inequality means in our economy and our society. And it could allow us to understand how, not only how growth is distributed, but then what kinds of policies we need to make sure that we are on a stronger path moving forward. And of course, the need to understand these differences has become so much more apparent in 2020, which is a year that has really shown us what inequality looks like, the damage that it can wring on an economy, and just how vulnerable it has left the United States relative to our economic competitors. So my call to action for you all is this. Measuring what matters is a first step towards identifying a new economic agenda. And I hope that today's rising generation of economists can, and I really, really hope will, play a pivotal role in crafting new metrics for this new agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was absolutely wonderful. And I'm looking forward to the question and answers. Lucas, I think that you're up if you want to share your screen and take over.
Good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are in the world. It's 6 p.m. here in Paris. I'm really delighted to be able to present this new book called Unsustainable Inequalities, Social Justice and the Environment. Basically, the main thesis of the book is that environmental inequalities are the new frontier of social justice, and we need to pay more attention to them, both in research and into how we design and think about policy. This book was written before COVID, but I think it's even more relevant in the context of the post or current COVID situation world, in the sense that COVID has exacerbated economic, racial, gender divides in societies, at least for the amount of data that we've been able to gather so far. And it is pretty clear from existing research on the impact of environmental shocks on societies that the continuation of environmental degradation, the continuation of climate change on the trends that we know of today will exacerbate these various forms of inequalities in the future as well. So the question is really, how do we rethink our social systems in the light of what Heather Boushey was presenting in her presentation, but also while factoring the new environmental inequalities, new environmental injustices that are specific to the 21st century. And in the book, I start with this, yellow vest movement, which may seem pretty specific to the French case, where you have a government that wants to implement a carbon tax. And there's a part of the population that basically says, look, we may care about the environment, but in that case, we won't have any money anymore to pay our rent, to buy basic consumer goods. So you just cannot increase the carbon tax like that, while at the same time, you're reducing the tax on the wealthy, which is what was happening in France at the time. And the point I'm making is that climate policies that are blind to inequality concerns are very likely to fail. And this is not only a specific case to France. This happened in Indonesia. You can see here a picture from Indonesia when the government tried to reduce fossil fuel subsidies. This is also very present and pregnant in the context of the US election, for instance, and issues around fracking in Pennsylvania, and the type of policies related to the environment that candidates are able or not able to put on the table for discussion because of this importance of the question of jobs related to environmental transition. So let me really rapidly go towards the three main ideas that I try to develop in this book. The first one is mapping and tracking. And here again, I'm really in line with what Heather Boushey was saying before. I'm trying to extend this argument to the social environmental nexus. Currently, we are in the prehistory of the age of public data, public information on these issues. We live in a data abundant world, but we do not have public service of inequality data. This is true when we think about income and wealth, but this is even more true when we think about who pollutes, which income groups, which geographic areas, and who is impacted by pollution, which income groups, which classes, which ethnic groups, with genders. And we really need to develop these tools and these mechanisms. I won't spend too much time on this for the time being, but this is really essential. Now, once this data is available, it will make it possible to first design much better climate policies that are not blind to their environmental impacts, but also rethink the whole set of public policy tools that we can develop in order to prevent environmental inequalities to be generated or to compensate them in a better way. And the first point I'd like to make is that the first thing is we need to better prevent these inequalities from happening. And this falls in the realm of pre-distribution policies, in the sense that we need to invest in public services of the energy transition. Just one example here, Sweden has the highest carbon tax rate in the world today. And, it's not a very big deal. Why? Because the Swedes invested from the 1917 onwards in municipal renewable energy systems, which made it possible for consumers, for citizens to have a choice as soon as the carbon tax was implemented, they could choose between continue to pay a lot of carbon tax on carbon fuels, or switch to more renewable energy solutions. And this was really made possible thanks to these investments. Another example from the emerging world, which I think is extremely interesting, in Indonesia, when the government increased the price on fossil fuels, there were first social unrest, social mobilizations. But what the government did in the end was to increase the price of fuels by reducing the subsidies that were put in place on fossil fuels, but use this money to finance education, health, and cash transfers to low-income groups. So there is a shift in how public policy was done, with what we could call the emergence of a social ecological reform. And I think this is really what we need to go towards. And this is what I discuss more at length in the book, with the development of a social ecological public service. And this also falls into thinking about when we think about job losses, we need a better integration of social administrations and environmental side of government, in order to be better able, for instance, when there are cash transfers involved for certain households that have little income, to take into account the value of the energy that they have to purchase, and the energy inefficiencies in their home or in the infrastructure around them. So we need to better design these public assistance systems, thinking not only about the social, but also about environmental constraints. And the final point, to conclude very briefly, of course, this is not costless. This costs some money, but in societies where wealth and income are more and more concentrated, there is a strong argument to be made that we need more progressive taxes, and that these more progressive taxes can mean that there is more money to invest in public services without increasing the taxes on the working class or on the middle class. And here I'm extending this argument with this idea that we also need to develop these new form of taxes on high polluters, and also on those who detain high polluting assets. So 2 arguments to finish with. The first one, in the emerging world, there is today and for the coming years, but this won't last long, there is a window of opportunity to tax pollution before it's too late. In 5 years, in 10 years, or 15 years, the middle class and a big part of the low income groups will already have adopted polluting lifestyles. So taxing pollution then will not be progressive anymore. If you do this now, for the moment, it's progressive. It won't be the case in a few years. Now, at the more global level, and thinking about rich countries as well, this graph just tells you that emissions are super concentrated. The 1% richest individuals have emitted 2 times more emissions over 50 years than the entire bottom 50% as a whole. So we also need to make this top 1% contribute to the financing of the social, ecological, public services that I was discussing before. And we need to do this while thinking about the carbon content of their assets. Most of the discussion about carbon taxation is about consumers, how we emit pollution as consumers, and we often forget that there's a lot of carbon in our equities, if we own equities, in the assets we own when we own them. And this represents a huge part of the emissions of the top 1%, more than 50%, as I discuss in the book and in some other work. So I'll stop here. And I think that this is a very exciting area for research on inequality on the environment, and also a very exciting area for public policy design. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucas. That was fascinating. And again, looking forward to the question and answer. So next up is Nathan Hendren.
Today I'm going to talk about an idea that I don't know if it's a big idea, I don't know if it's a new idea, but I think it's an idea that I think is important and that I think I can share some new empirical evidence to speak to. And it's the idea that investing in low-income children pays us back. This is based on joint work with a graduate student here at Harvard, Ben Sprung-Kaiser, and a large team of research assistants at Opportunity Insights that I also want to thank at the outset. What we were after in this work was really a broad swath attempt of understanding what types of government policy changes have historically done the most to improve societal well-being. And we addressed this by conducting a unified welfare analysis of historical policy changes in the United States over the past half century. In particular, we studied 133 policy changes that had been rigorously studied in existing academic work that spanned four major categories: social insurance, education and job training, taxes and cash transfers, and in-kind transfers. And what we did was we took estimates from this existing literature to construct two numbers for each of these policies. The first is we tried to measure the benefits that this policy provided to its beneficiaries or its recipients, where we measured that, as kind of economists might, as using people's kind of willingness to pay for that policy. The second, which turns out to be crucial, is we measured the net cost of the policy to the government, where the key was to account for not only any upfront costs in a policy that the government undertakes, but also any indirect impacts that might feed back onto the government budget. So for example, in economics, we often talk about if you tax somebody, they might change their income and might impose a distortion on the economy, and that would make a policy more costly than it might look at the outset. But the flip side, if you have, say, an education policy that causes people to have higher earnings, that actually could lead them to pay higher taxes in the future. And that has to be subtracted for calculating the net long-run cost to the government of all of these different policies. Now, to summarize across all of these different policies, we took a ratio of those benefits to the net cost to the government to form what we call its marginal value of public funds. It just measures a policy's sort of bang for the buck. For every dollar that the government spends on the policy, how much benefit did it provide to the beneficiaries of that policy? And I won't go into the details of how we estimate all of these numbers for each of the 133 policies, but what I'll do is I'll show you the patterns that we find and summarize kind of the main conclusion that speaks to the original motivation. So this is showing you each of the MVPF estimates for the policies in our sample, where on the horizontal axis, you see the age of the targeted beneficiaries of the policy, and on the vertical axis, you see its bang for the buck, its MVPF. And what you see is very high returns for policies targeting children. So for example, some that you might be familiar with are policies like Abecedarian or Peri Preschool or Head Start, these types of preschool policies that have often gotten attention in the literature. But we also found very high returns for, say, many college policies throughout an education throughout childhood. We also found that 3 out of 4 of the major Medicaid expansions to low-income kids throughout the past 50 years have actually, in the long run, had very, very high returns and actually paid back the initial upfront expenditure to the government. Now, in contrast, we found lower returns for policies targeting adults. Importantly, this is not to say that these policies are bad policies necessarily. It's just they're not necessarily having as high of a return on that spending, and they involve different trade-offs across the economy. Now, before you read into any of these particular estimates too much, I should just highlight that any particular estimate that we have in the sample has some statistical imprecision associated with it. But what we can do is we can form broad category averages across each of the different categories of policies that we studied. And what you can see here is really a clear statistically significant trend that policies that have historically made direct investments in low-income kids, in their education, in their health, and in their college, all throughout college, have historically had the highest MVPFs. And as you see here on the line, where they're actually plotted up there on a line that I'm going to call infinity. And so what does that actually mean? Well, the easier way to see this is to think about just the denominator of that MVPF, which is for every dollar the government spent on that policy, how much did it actually cost the government in the long run? And what you see is that on average, historically, when the government has made investments in a child's education, in their health, or in their college attendance, or expanding access to colleges, we see that the policy might have an upfront expenditure of $1, but historically, over the life cycle, it ends up paying us back through increased tax revenue, reduced medical expenditures that the government would otherwise be paying when those kids are adults. And so this suggests that really the calculus for policies targeting children looks different than the canonical trade-offs that we often talk about in economic policy. We tend to think of policies as, do you want to help this group or do you want to help that group? And when we look at adults, you see that all of these costs of these policies over here on the right, they are positive. When we talk about moving money into a particular policy, there are trade-offs that will be involved in those policies. But historically, when we've invested in children, and in particular in low-income children, those expenditures have over the long run actually come back to pay us back. And so that's the core idea that I wanted to bring to all of you. The direct investment in low-income children have had the highest returns, and they're often paying for themselves. And that the adult policies are really facing these classic trade-offs that we teach in economics. And so that's the core idea. I'll also just give you a plug if you wanted to see all the estimates, since I know we didn't have time. They're all available at policyinsights.org, and I look forward to answering any questions in the break.
Next up is Anna Stansbury. And Anna, you can share your screen and take it away whenever you're ready.
Thanks very much. So I'm really flattered to be on a lineup with so many people with such interesting ideas and also whose research I very much admire. So pleased to be here with you all today. I am a PhD scholar, Stone PhD scholar in the Inequality Program, and an economics PhD candidate. I specialize in labor and macroeconomics. And the idea I'm presenting today is not a new idea, but it is a big idea. I think that if we are serious about tackling inequality, and perhaps even thinking bigger than reversing the increase in inequality we've seen to actually achieve a more equitable and equal society than we've ever seen before, we need a fundamental redistribution of power. And a big part of that fundamental redistribution of power needs to be a rebuilding of worker power. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'll make three arguments. First, that the decline in worker power that we've seen in the US can explain a very large share of the rise in US income inequality over recent decades. Second, that differentials in worker power, and particularly a lack of power for most workers, are extremely important in explaining many other inequalities to do with health, autonomy, and safety, and the intersections of these inequalities along class, race, and gender lines. And third, that a sustained power base organized around socioeconomic lines, particularly worker power, matters for other types of sustainable political and social change we might care about if we are to reverse the rises in inequality that we've seen. What do I mean by worker power? Largely, I mean formal institutions that promote workers' power, voice, or influence around workplace matters. The most obvious example of that is unions. You can also think about workers on corporate boards or other corporate governance arrangements that promote workers' power. You can think about employee ownership of firms or even cooperatives. You can think about works councils or occupational health and safety councils that make decisions at the firm level. Or you can think about sector or national level wage boards that have worker representation on them. In the US, which is what I'll focus on today, both formal and informal types of worker power have seen a massive decline over recent decades. This chart from the Washington Center for Equitable Growth shows private sector union membership. Between the 1940s and 1960s, 1 in every 3 workers in the private sector in the US was in a union. Now that figure is 6%. Alongside this, in a recent paper, Larry Summers and I argue, and many others have argued similarly, informal institutions around pay equity, fairness within the workplace have declined, leading to increasing within and across establishment pay inequalities. And this has been reinforced by the rise of what we call the ruthless economy, management practices and corporate governance practices, capital markets institutions like private equity and leveraged buyouts that increase the focus on cost cutting above all else, including cost cutting of workers' pay and compensation packages. So this seems to matter in and of itself, but it's actually been hotly debated as to the degree to which the decline in worker power can explain income inequality. And many arguments would suggest that the rise in income inequality we've seen has been driven by market-based factors or secular changes in technological progress or in globalization. But the way I read the evidence is that there's an increasing collage of evidence being brought to bear to suggest that actually a very large share of the rise in income inequality we've seen has been because of these declines in worker power and the associated societal and systemic changes. One example I can share from my own work with Larry Summers this year is the decline in the labor share of income. We try to quantify the degree to which the decline in US worker power, unions, and these softer, more societal factors can explain a decline in the share of profits or rents that accrue to workers in the private sector. And we find that actually our estimate of the decline in workers' share of profits can explain the entirety of the decline in the labor share of income in the US in recent years. Beyond this, other research focuses on the role of the decline in worker power in labor income inequality. So we were looking at between labor and capital. Others look at the rising inequality between lower and middle income workers and workers in the higher ends of the distribution. The decline in unions hit lower income workers particularly hard. It was concentrated among workers without a college education. And recent work suggests that a large share of the rise in the Gini coefficient in the 9-to-10 ratio of inequality can be explained by the decline in worker power in the US. The top 1% share of income and wealth concentration has been a huge concern in recent years. And this too can partly be explained by the decline in worker power. Part of this rise in the top 1% share of income has, of course, been a phenomenon of the fall in the labor share and the rise in the capital share of income, because capital ownership is really concentrated at the top of the income distribution. And part of it has been a rises in the incomes of top management, CEOs, owner-managers of privately held firms. And a lot of that too, we find, can be explained by a redistribution of income from typical workers as they lose power to these higher earning managerial class of workers. The decline in the racial wage gap has slowed, particularly in the latter part of the 20th century. The decline in worker power, and particularly in union membership, hit hardest non-white groups of workers, and particularly African Americans, who were more likely to be unionized. And it's worth noting that while I'm focusing on the US, the rises in income inequality that we've seen have been particularly pronounced in the US. The fall in the labor share has been particularly pronounced in the US. And the US is also the country that's seen the sharpest declines in worker power in recent decades. So I focused the majority of my time on whether declining worker power can explain the trends in inequality that we've seen. That's what I focused my research on so far. But I think it's important to emphasize that income inequality isn't the only dimension of inequality that we care about, and that it intersects with a lot of other dimensions of inequality that worker power has a big impact on. We're in the middle of a pandemic where essential workers, workers in delivery and logistics, workers in food service, workers in healthcare, have been unable to access the protective equipment and practices they need to stay safe from a pandemic at the workplace, have tried to use their voice to influence that, and have often fallen short. We know that autonomy on the job is one of the biggest determinants of workplace satisfaction. And yet increasingly, particularly for lower income workers, we're seeing work becoming more routinized, less interesting, and less autonomous, partly, I would argue, as a result of a lack of voice of those workers in the workplace. We know that a lack of power reduces workers' ability to stand up to or remove themselves from situations where they're exposed to harassment and abuse. And this particularly impacts people who are already disadvantaged in the workplace, whether because of their socioeconomic status, their immigration status, their race, their gender, their ability. And we know, of course, that economic justice has long been treated as a part of a broader agenda for racial justice and social justice. And the third plank of my argument is that worker power matters, not just for the changes I've talked about, but for a broader sustainable social and political change. For any type of social reform, particularly of the scale that we need if we're to combat inequality, you need organized interest groups that can advocate for, mobilize for, enact, and sustain political change. To fight income inequality, you need interest groups that are mobilized around common socioeconomic interests, common class-based interests. And historically, and there's swathes of work on from history and political science that I can't do justice to now, that say this. Historically, worker power and organized labor have been very important factors in achieving broader progressive change around socioeconomic interests. What to do? I will leave that for the question and answer, for other research. There's a lot of interesting ideas. My favorites are sectoral collective bargaining, co-determination, having worker representation on boards, and having firm level councils that give workers say over vital things like occupational health and safety practices. There are a lot of obstacles that need to be overcome. But one of the important ones, I think, is simply having this on the agenda and having it as a central part of our agenda when we think about income inequality and economic inequality. And so I want to leave with a final observation, which is, if redistributing power is to be a central part of our agenda in tackling inequality, it no longer suffices for us as researchers to think of ourselves as disinterested technocrats. Instead, I think we also need to examine our own role and the role of our institution in upholding or in tackling and dismantling the power systems that perpetuate and entrench systemic inequality. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that wonderful talk. Fifth and most certainly least is myself. So let me dive right in. So the big idea I want to talk about today is reducing racial disparities in the pretrial bail system. I also want to kind of say at the outset that this is ongoing work rather than finished work, but I am so excited about it that I decided to talk about it even before it's necessarily ready for prime time. So the motivation for this work and why we think it's such a big deal is that pretrial detention rates are incredibly high in the United States in particular. And this mirrors a lot of other statistics you'd see from the criminal justice system, but I do think pretrial detention is one of the true outliers. So per 100,000 individuals, in the United States, we detain about 150 people before trial. The next highest country is Chile or Mexico at around 80, and the mean is closer to about 50, so 1/3 of the rates that you'd see in the US. Now, of course, those detention rates are varied within the United States. So while even the country as a whole is perhaps over-detaining people, we see particular areas that have even higher rates. So Harris County, Texas, Orange County, California, and others have rates that are 40 or 50 or 60% higher than can be explained based on the defendant characteristics that we see. Now, one of the really terrible things that comes along with these very high detention rates is it tends to be focused on non-white defendants. So, here on the right side, we've listed the counties that have the highest Black pretrial detention rate, that again is not explained by any differences in characteristics. And you see a lot of the same counties. So places like Orange County, California, and Harris County, Texas, dramatically over-detain Black defendants relative to white defendants, as well as just detaining too many defendants, period. Now, the consequences of this pretrial detention can be quite severe. Now, we see this both in the quantitative research that I've done with my co-authors, as well as just stories from the field or more qualitative research. So this is one quote from the New York Times on an expose about pretrial detention. And what the defense attorney said is that the clients are in these service level positions, they're losing their jobs even if they're gone just for a day or two. If you live in shelters, you might lose your housing. If you have immigration concerns, that might be something that could actually lead to deportation. And so the consequences that lead from even a couple days of detention can be really severe. Now, the final thought that kind of motivates the work that we're doing now is that none of these gaps that we're seeing in pretrial detention between white and non-white defendants seems explained by any legally relevant characteristics or legally relevant variables. One way to think about this is to ask, among the set of defendants that judges are on the margin between releasing and detaining, so this last set where they're really setting that cutoff, we see that judges are releasing relatively risky white defendants, defendants that have about a 25% chance of committing some form of pretrial misconduct, albeit usually a fairly low level form of misconduct, like not showing up to court. In sharp contrast, the last Black defendants that judges are letting out are essentially riskless. They have a nearly 0% chance of committing any misconduct. Put another way, this is saying that bail judges in this country are holding Black defendants to a much higher bar than they are white defendants. And it just doesn't seem justified by any legally relevant variables that we're seeing in the data or that people are seeing on the ground. So the big idea that we have, the we being myself and Crystal Yang at Harvard Law School, is wanting to reduce these racial disparities in the pretrial system and improve decision-making more generally. So what we're doing now is we're partnering with courts from around the country to help improve that decision-making with a particular focus on these racial disparities. And what we've done is essentially take the best ideas of everyone else and taken them to the criminal justice system. So we found effective strategies from other settings that each is meant to tackle a key stage of the decision-making process where cognitive biases or errors can occur. Just very quickly, the three things that we're trying to correct. The first is to correct mistaken beliefs on defendant risk. So one of the things that we see both in the quantitative data and the survey data is that judges dramatically overstate the risk of Black defendants relative to white defendants. And this can naturally lead to the overdetention of those Black defendants. So the first thing we do is just simply present information that corrects those mistaken beliefs. And we do that using just very simple statistics showing that in practice, Black defendants are not particularly more risky than white defendants, but those judges are acting as though they're far more risky. I should say that both these data that I'm presenting here and all the future data are just made up for illustrational purposes. They're not from any particular court. So they're broadly representative of what you might see, but you shouldn't take this as literally the truth in any particular county. The second thing that we're doing in our experiments is we're trying to systematize decision-making. So what does that mean? It means that we're trying to make judges just be more consistent in the factors they consider. So there's a lot of evidence, whether from medicine or even the military, that people kind of change what they think about as they're facing the same set of decisions. And if you can focus them on the same characteristics, decision-making dramatically improves. And so we're working with each of the courts to decide what are the key characteristics that judges should be considering in each and every case, and actually have the judges fill out this form with every case they decide. We've also asked them to write down what other factors they consider important, so that they have to justify, at least to themselves, why they're coming to a different decision for this defendant versus another defendant with those same characteristics. Finally, and I think perhaps most importantly, is we're providing individualized feedback to the judges. So in all of our prep work for these experiments, we've gone out to judges and we've just asked in conversation, well, what do you think your release rate is? So how many defendants that you see do you think you release? And among those that you release, what fraction do you think have some form of misconduct? And every single judge has told us they have no idea. Now, this is an incredibly important setting, but they get absolutely zero feedback. So they don't know if their release rate is 40% or 80%, let alone how it varies among other judges or among other types of defendants. And so perhaps it shouldn't be a surprise that stereotypes and just our kind of mistaken beliefs are guiding these decisions. And so we are providing a range of individualized feedback. The first is just a set of very basic statistics on what their release rate actually is, both overall and among both white and non-white defendants. We also then break that down for the appearance rate and the arrest-free rate among those individuals. And in the vast majority of courts, what we're showing is that judges are releasing far fewer people than they think they are. And the good conduct rates, or these appearance rates, are actually much higher than the judges think they are. That's kind of what the early evidence is showing. Now, to promote changes and to give more of a goal about where judges should go, we're also showing how those judges compare to what might be possible if they were making better decisions. So we're not necessarily telling them that your release rate should be higher or lower, or you should do a better job of releasing the low risk versus high risk defendants, but we're giving them a set of choices where they can move closer to whatever their preferences might be. And then finally, we're showing how their rates are changing over time. The goal, of course, is that as we're providing information, that will allow judges to make better decisions and judges that are more racially fair. Decisions that are more racially fair. We want to provide that feedback because otherwise it's very hard to know whether your decisions are actually improving. One of the early findings that is coming out of other work is that while interventions may briefly change how judges make decisions, they seem to slip back after a few weeks or a few months. Our hypothesis is this is largely because judges don't actually know they're improving. It's very hard to tell if you're releasing just a few % more people without that feedback. So this is what we're doing now, and we're rolling out in courts all over the country. And we're very excited to hopefully share the results with you in the coming days. And finally, we're going to have Felix Owusu talk to us about inequality in the criminal justice system more broadly. So Felix, feel free to take it away whenever you're ready.
Hello, everybody. Thank you guys for taking the time to listen today. I'm honored to be invited to speak on such a prestigious panel with many people who I look up to. So I'm Felix Owusu. I'm a PhD candidate in public policy here at the Kennedy School. I'm also a Stone PhD scholar. In addition to that, I work in the District of Columbia's government. So I live and work in Washington, D.C. right now, and I'm embedded in the police department as a data scientist and also at the lab at D.C., which is a research group in the mayor's office. So I'm going to be speaking a little bit about reimagining public safety in our communities and thinking beyond the criminal system as a way to produce public safety in our communities. So the first point that I want to drive home is that the criminal system is a very costly way to produce public safety in our communities. So this is sort of beyond the financial cost of policing and prison budgets and things like that, which are in many cases staggering. But even beyond that, we see that there's a lot of externalities for the people who we actually use the criminal system or who actually engage with the criminal system. And so this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of research that's available on this topic, but we see costs in terms of a variety of outcomes. We see less political engagement for people who are in highly surveilled communities. We see worse educational outcomes for people who have to deal with lots of surveillance, and some work by somebody at the Kennedy School, Desmond Eng, is speaking to the impact of police violence on students who live in communities where that happens. We see psychological distress. There's research on that, and probably anybody here who's been involved in a traffic stop and seen those lights come on behind you can speak to the stress that can generate. And then health consequences beyond that in terms of other kinds of physical health. The economic costs of being involved in the criminal system, even in a minor way, can be very long lasting for people's trajectory and ability to be able to earn income to provide for themselves and their families. And in some cases, actually, there's evidence that being involved in our criminal system can lead to more crime later. And this is particularly an issue when we use the criminal system to address problems among our youth, sending young people to interact with police or to be incarcerated. There's evidence that actually can lead them to be more involved in crime later in time. And so these are all costs beyond the already large budgetary costs that the criminal system generates to produce public safety. And very importantly, these costs are not borne equally, right? Certain communities are much more subject to involvement in the criminal system, and thus these costs. And in some cases, those are the communities that are least benefiting from the public safety that's created by this system. And so these costs, I think, are particularly important given the way that they're concentrated. And so I'm going to speak to a little bit of the work that I've done in my various roles on this and try and get to a little bit of what I think alternatives to this might be. So this is, I'm going to provide a little bit of information looking at, on the policing side of things, disparities that we're seeing there. One of the things that I've worked on in my capacity with DC government is putting together the first data set of all of the stops that the Metropolitan Police Department conducts over the course of its activities, and that's traffic stops, something that is as minor as getting a warning for speeding, all the way to arrest, investigatory stops where people are being searched, even boat stops. Apparently people are stopped in the harbor. And so any situation in which you're not free to go basically is something that's going to be included here. This breakdown focuses on these non-traffic stops. So things where there might have been a search involved, you might have been questioned about a specific crime, something more serious than a speeding ticket. And here we see citywide, the rate at which Black people are stopped. Black people are 87% of the overall stops that are happening. And so this is broken out by police district. If anybody's familiar with DC, 6 and 7D, those are in the southeast. So 7D is going to be including areas like Anacostia. 60 is southeast across the river, right? And so DC is a chocolate city. There's a lot of Black people there. I live here right now. It's great to see so many Black people. It is not 90% Black. But the overall stop rate is, very disproportionate in terms of who stopped. And people in areas where more Black people are being stopped are more likely to be subject to further investigation, like a search or a pat down. So the burden of police scrutiny is very unequally applied. And so this is speaking to DC, but similar results could be generated, as far as I know, in basically any jurisdiction nationwide. And so this is actually speaking to the court process, and this is looking at data from Massachusetts. I worked on an analysis of racial disparities in the court process in Massachusetts with some folks over at Harvard Law School. This was an analysis that was actually requested by the Supreme Judicial Court because racial disparities in incarceration were so high, not just globally, but even Massachusetts compared to other states in the United States was one that was indicated as having substantial racial disparities, higher than average. And so what we found in our work, we looked at a lot of the specific decision points throughout the very convoluted and complex criminal process. But we did, I'll spare you a lot of that. But what we did find is there's a basic overrepresentation that is well understood and well documented. We replicate that finding, and this figure just shows the caseload versus people, or the racial breakdown of the population in Massachusetts. And you can see people of color are substantially overrepresented in the caseload. And then a quick highlight of results. Black and Latinx people are much more likely to be adjudicated in more serious courts where the penalties available are much longer. They do get longer sentences when they're incarcerated, substantially longer, 168 days longer on average for Black people, 148 days longer for Latinx people. And really, the disparities are particularly extreme for categories of conduct that have been racialized and stigmatized in the past, things like weapons charges and drug crime. And then mandatory minimums also played a pretty significant role. And so we see that there's these substantial racial disparities in the way that we use these systems, and in the context of these costs that I highlighted at the outset. I think these disparities are particularly troubling. And so thinking sort of beyond this criminal system, which is super costly financially and in terms of these externalities that are generated for the communities that interact with it, I think it's important to think about how we should be pushing for public safety, which is still a super important concern, right? People want to live in safe communities where they can walk down the street safely and all these kinds of things. But so taking these concerns seriously, but also acknowledging the cost that this approach that we're using right now so heavily generates is important. So the first thing that I want to recommend going forward, and this is something that I think is supported by research, but also comes up a lot. I have just heard this sort of push from everyone from community activists to chiefs of police who have been in departments that have undergone various reforms, often precipitated by consent decrees and federal oversight, right? But substantially fewer stops are possible without a substantial increase in costs for public safety. This is just showing the incidence of stop and frisk in New York over the past several years. This is from the New York Civil Liberties Union. As you can see, from its peak in about 2011, of nearly 700,000 stops, and NYPD has been able to reduce the number of stops that it undertakes drastically. Very, very much a huge reduction in this. And there hasn't been, as was initially thought, pandemonium in terms of huge spikes in violent crime that could be attributed to this, right? And so this really indicates that a huge amount of the activity and these costs that were being generated by this very heavy police interaction weren't actually generating all of that much, right? And I think different communities will have different problems, but we often say, think of this as an all or nothing approach to how we're looking at what police do. Either we get all of their actions or we get none of the actions and it's anarchy. But this goes to show that there's actually a huge percentage in many jurisdictions of what police actually do day to day on the streets that isn't necessarily obviously generating additional public safety in terms of reducing violence and the things that people are worried about. And so I just wanted to highlight that there seems to be in a lot of jurisdictions low-hanging fruit in terms of things that we can do and reduce these costs without much of a public safety backlash. Another thing that I wanted to highlight in terms of what we can do to limit the initial footprint of policing and these costs that are generated is thinking about alternatives to first response. And so this is something, a model of having alternative first responders who are not armed and who are not there to sort of adjudicate whether somebody's going to enter the criminal system, but actually addressing the underlying needs that people face as the primary focus of a first responder. And so this image is from the CAHOOTS program from Eugene, Oregon. I think that stands for Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. But it's basically a situation where you can call 911. And right now, in many jurisdictions, it's do you send the fire department, do you send an ambulance, or do you send the police as the options that many people have, trying to broaden the scope of things that we have well-resourced first responders to address, so that we're not sending police to do things like deal with mental health crises, deal with homelessness, deal with school discipline problems, this huge breadth of problems in our society that we're asking police to solve. And many of them will tell you, we don't feel equipped to be doing this, right? In DC, I know police are doing all sorts of things from providing Narcan for people who are doing overdoses, to trying to divert people into programs. And so there are alternatives in terms of first response that are being tested and are being expanded and are showing promising results. I think we need to invest in those things heavily, and to a similar extent to how we're investing in the armed first response. That is our sort of go-to response in many situations. So limiting the role of armed agents of the state in terms of responding to our public safety concerns. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is only relying on criminal adjudication when it's more effective than similarly resourced alternatives. So thinking about how do we take the problem seriously, but then from first principles, come up with a solution for how we would want to address that problem. So one example that I'm currently working on right now is thinking about how we use the automated traffic enforcement infrastructure that is currently being used to, in many jurisdictions, keep track of who's speeding or running red lights and then print tickets. Rather than to print those tickets, use that to understand what behaviors lead to traffic fatalities, which is the thing that we care about and would like to avoid. And then can we use behavioral science and other kinds of interventions that are not even, that rather than being law enforcement or even a financial penalty, something that actually addresses the underlying behavior without the costs associated with that, right? So that's one example of taking the problem seriously, but using an approach that's outside of the criminal system. One example that I found really compelling looking in Massachusetts was the example of drunk driving here. It's by far the most common charge that can be adjudicated in such a way that there'd be mandatory incarceration in Massachusetts. And so it could be that people who are coming in with this charge as a repeat drunk driver could be sent to incarceration if they're convicted of this. But in fact, only about 10% of the people who are convicted in cases that involve these charges are incarcerated at all. Instead, many are allowed to enter substance abuse treatment in lieu of jail, right? And so this is already an instance in which people have recognized that maybe the criminal justice response to just putting somebody in jail is not going to be the thing that's going to solve the problem. And so there's been a new set of programming that looks at a public health and education framework to address the problem. One of the issues, though, is that we have this for drunk driving, but not for a lot of other things. And specifically, drunk driving is something that is overwhelmingly white in this state. And defendants have to be able to pay for this treatment to be eligible for this thing that lets them avoid incarceration, right? And so how are we resourcing these things? And in which cases are we using this framework to, think about the more compassionate response that's still going to address the problem, right? Anecdotally, I lived in Iowa growing up. My parents live there right now. We have problems like anybody else, but the police are used for almost nothing, right? We have a lot of other tools that people to deploy to address the public safety concerns that we have and the needs of the people in the community. There's ways that we can think about addressing the root causes of problems we face in our community. And in many cases, we have that knowledge and deploy it naturally. We just don't deploy it evenly, and we don't deploy it sort of consistently across groups. And so I think racial disparities constitute a very serious problem that we need to be addressing and working through. But part of me wants to say that, like, rather than how can we get people to do things evenly across groups and still use punishment as our go-to method, how do we move things out of that framework entirely and address the underlying concerns in a different way? And at that point, the racial disparities that we're seeing in our system kind of become moot. And I think there's a lot of headway to be able to do that. And so happy to talk about this a little bit more in detail during the Q&A. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Felix. I see a question from Valentina Gabriela.
I'm actually a student at PSE, Paris School of Economics, studying public policy and development, and I found this super interesting. I wasn't in the previous one, so very, very glad to join. My question was for Lucas Kramer, and I wanted to know, like, the main difficulties that he faced or he thinks that there are when considering the unsustainable inequalities.
Well understood. So very briefly, because we have 15 minutes overall, right, for all speakers. So I think my point 1 and my point 3 are fairly connected. I mean, all points are connected, but if we want to have a better tax system that taxes, pollution in a much more modern way, and that taxes pollution also in a progressive manner, we also need to develop this system where we're better able to track who is polluting, and this amounts to better tracking, the carbon content of consumption, but also of asset ownership. And for the moment, we're really, really far from that. Basically, if you want to invest some of your savings into some products that are, sustainable development labeled, in many countries, there's no label at all. There's no standard, there's no regulations that are going to tell you this is a green investment. And so we really need to develop these kinds of standards if we really want to be first able to redirect savings towards green transition, and if we also want to accelerate this transition with some amount of taxation. And so this is really about using all the data science that we have, not only to enrich the GAFAs, but also to make our public policy makers more effective at pursuing these, sustainable development goals and objectives.
Great. And next up is Jenny Mansbridge.
Oh, this is a question for Will. What does high performing mean? Does it mean fewer disparities, or does it mean a closer match to subsequent good performance after being released?
Yeah, great question, and something that we agonized over a little bit. So the somewhat ad hoc definition that we're going with for the overall performance, we're saying that you have to be above median, both in terms of your release rate, so that is high release rates, and above median in the absence of misconduct. So relatively few people have misconduct. In most jurisdictions, that works out to about the top 20% of judges in that two-dimensional space. For the racial disparities plots, we enforce that a judge has to, all four conditions have to hold. So both for white and non-white defendants, they need to be above median in their release rates and in their good conduct rates. Usually that's only about 10% of judges or so, depending on the jurisdiction. And that's something that we kind of settled on that after talking to the judges in most jurisdictions. There's a little bit of wiggle room if a particular jurisdiction wants to go a different way.
Because I think that if I were an unsympathetic judge, and there will be many, the high release rates would seem to me a politically motivated criterion, not a quote unquote scientifically motivated criterion. Low release rates could be a high performing judge on some people's criteria. So I'm sure you've thought of that. And why did you decide against it? Why did you decide to include that?
Even so it's a great question.
People, in short.
Yeah. So here we're really helped by the fact that the goals of the pretrial system are very explicit in all 50 state constitutions, as well as in the US Constitution. And they say that judges need to maximize release rates while ensuring public safety. Now, the details will vary across all 50 states. So all bail judges are explicitly told that they need to have very high release rates, conditional on ensuring public safety. Now, there is reasonable disagreement on where judges should draw that threshold, of course. And that's why we're allowing judges to sort of pick which combination they want. But there's sort of universal agreement, both in the legal system more broadly and among the judges we're working with, that they ought to be releasing as many people as they can, conditional on ensuring public safety. But again, it's a great question, and luckily there hasn't been much pushback because of how clear the state constitutions are on this point. Brian Highsmith, I think if you want to ask your question.
Yes, this is for Will and Felix. I was wondering if you could. So Felix's presentation was called "Reimagining Public Safety," and when you hear many advocates talking about organizing for change in the punishment space, they talk about creating something that doesn't exist and has not existed before. And so I was wondering if either of you could share a little bit about the role of empirical science in sort of, to the extent that folks are trying to think of things that have not existed before, and you are only able to test policies that have been implemented. What are some of the challenges you face and ways that you can overcome those challenges?
Yeah, I can speak to this a little bit. And so I think you're right that it's a challenge to be a researcher in this kind of context, so you can only research what happens. Part of why I decided to come to DC was that they were trying things that were more ambitious than I think are common for other police departments. I would not have gone to a random police department. And so I think there's a certain role for just people who are, for whatever reason, either they're compelled through some federal oversight or they have progressive people in charge that will lead these kinds of conversations, then people tend to follow pretty quickly once things are established. I think that's part of it. And I think also research and sort of other kinds of organizing go hand in hand, right? The analysis that we did with the Massachusetts Supreme Court was only possible because the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who unfortunately passed recently, advocated very hard to make that kind of data available. And since then, we've been speaking to anybody who will listen, whether it's prosecutors, chiefs of police, or other people on the implications of that to move forward and try and make that kind of stuff happen. But those doors have been opened by, advocates and by organizing. And so like Black Lives Matter, other kinds of community organizations, that sort of applies the pressure that makes people need to have alternatives that they can test, right? Nothing that I can do happens sort of in a vacuum. And I see this as sort of, different lanes that are all pushing towards the same kind of outcome. And so I think these things kind of happen in tandem. And I wish it were easier, but there's really have to like find unicorns and then go from there. It's been my experience.
So that was a great answer. And in the interest of time, I'm gonna just let Felix tackle that one. David Elwood.
Sure, quickly for Anna. Really enjoyed your presentation and certainly am deeply sympathetic to the goals. Indeed, first a comment and then a question. The comment is just, I'm actually suspicious that labor markets, particularly lower wage labor markets, are actually working less and less well. We see where evidence of monopsony. You started to talk some about those things. But I also think information is getting lost at a very high rate as people are no longer staying at firms for an extended period of time and more artificial rules come in. You miss 3 days, you're out kind of things. I think information about the quality and the capacity is lost. Similarly, workers don't have very good information about the quality of the employers. So that's one set of issues that voice sort of helps voice empower, but it's a different set of problems brought on by the nature of the economy. My question for you is, much of your discussion, to the extent it had policy side, was looking for at least a broad discussion of talking about ways to empower workers and give them greater voice. Many other labor strategies that have been worked on, often with the voice of workers, are things like minimum wages, mandates for benefits, and so forth. In some ways, that's kind of the opposite strategy. It's empowering workers at some level, but it's basically using the hand of government. Is there a way to think about when you should do what, or is one a trade-off? Is one, are they mutually supportive or contradictory? How do I think about that?
Great questions, and I wish we had hours to discuss them. So on the first point about kind of monopsony power in low wage markets and a loss of information about job quality and worker quality, I think you're right that these are not issues. And I think generally the issues that I'm talking about cannot be solved with one silver bullet of worker power. I just think it has to be a part of it and a big part of it. But I do think there are some aspects where they intersect. So there's an extent to which, and there's interesting work on the MIT Good Jobs Initiative on this. There's an extent to which you can think about two different equilibria, particularly in low wage labor markets. One equilibrium, which is a kind of high turnover, low investment by firms in workers, low investment by workers in firms, low wages, low job quality, low autonomy workplace, and one where there's the opposite and there are better pay, workers are invested in the firm invests in training the worker, there's a kind of better sense of match quality, higher productivity, and better pay. And you can see both strategies coexisting in low wage labor markets in the US, but the former is much more predominant than the latter. And I think to some extent, strategies that promote worker power can engage in equilibrium shifting, where if you have something like, if workers are empowered such that they can't be fired at will on the spot, for example, if they're empowered such that they have a say in how their workplace and their workday are designed, it becomes more economical for firms to invest in them and invest in longer term jobs. So I think there's an intersection. It's not a silver bullet, but I think there's an intersection. Quickly on the second point, it's a really interesting question as to whether empowering workers directly or providing for workplace reforms through government are complements or substitutes, I think. And so in one sense, you could think of them as substitutes. We can either give workers power through unions or a say on corporate boards to determine their workplace conditions, or we can legislate for it in the labor market. And you do see cross-country that a lot of countries which we think of as being very having a much more pro-worker polity actually have fewer workplace regulations and more determination of the things by unions. A really interesting example, Germany only just introduced a minimum wage in 2014, I think, for example. But there's an extent to which I think you need both, because unless you have a labor market where all workers are empowered, you get a situation where you can have a race to the bottom or undercutting unless the government plays some role. So I don't have a perfect answer yet on how one should divide the two, but I do think there's an important role for both. And I think, as I said, there's an important role for empowered workers in sustaining and advocating for the kind of broader workplace changes as well.
Great, thank you so much. And we're just a teeny bit over time, but we're going to sneak in one more question from Tridevi.
Hi, thanks, Will. My question is also for Anna Stansbury. So to what extent do you think the decline in worker power is driven by shifts away from or decline in industries with historically high rates of unionization, as opposed to changes in firm management and ownership practices?
That's a great question. I don't have time to go into it in detail now, but I think the short answer is it's a bit of both, but it's a lot less industrial composition than one might think if you hadn't sort of looked into it. So the rate of decline of unionization by industry in the US was relatively constant across all industries, which I think is interesting because some industries were very exposed to international trade, like manufacturing, and obviously manufacturing employment has declined a lot. But some industries were not, like construction or logistics within the US, trucking, those kind of industries. So the fact that the rate of unionization declined at the same rate across many industries with different international trade exposure is a big fact to me in suggesting that this is not just an industrial composition issue. This is a broader kind of policy hostility and social hostility to unions issue. It's obviously a factor. As manufacturing has declined as a part of the workforce, unionization has declined mechanically. But then I think the question becomes a bit the dog that didn't bark. Why didn't unionization rise in the sectors that replaced manufacturing in the private sector employment statistics? And that's a puzzle that could be to do with the innate nature of the workforce. Maybe it's more distributed, it's harder to organize smaller units, but it could be again a policy factor, and that's hard to tease out.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the last question, and just thank you everyone for attending. I thought this was a terrific session. Very briefly, next week we'll pick up again with talk about COVID-19 and inequality, which is a panel organized by Danny Schneider. But again, I hope that you can all help me thank all the participants today, and we look forward to seeing you next week. So thank you.